Welcome to the Perfect Place to Put a Practice podcast by Scott McDonald and drdemographics.com, the best source of demographic, psychographic, and marketing information for professionals.
Hello, this is Scott McDonald of Dr. Demographics, and today we're going to talk about targets and boundaries. Now, I'm bringing this up because many of you are ordering reports to do with a particular site. I want to explain how this is determined and how to interpret what information you're receiving. Ultimately, you probably understand the idea of having a target area that you're going to be covering. And that makes perfect sense. However, there are some people who are making some mistakes as to how to interpret what they're getting. So let me help you.
This episode of the Dr. Demographics podcast is brought to you by ConvertSocial.ai. For the past several years, ConvertSocial.ai has helped us post and promote this very podcast. Likely many of you found it and are listening to it due to the great work of the team at ConvertSocial.ai. Look, let's be honest. Most doctors struggle with staying consistent with their social media. They always start with great intentions, but things get busy and the social media for the practice gets forgotten. ConvertSocial.ai solves that consistency problem, and they do it at a price that's likely less than you're paying for Post-it notes each month for your office. Do yourself a favor, solve your social media problems by going to ConvertSocial.ai and let them know that Dr. Demographics sent you. That's ConvertSocial.ai.
Now, I don't want to say I'm the only person who understands practice boundaries and borders, how big they ought to be, and how many people they should contain in order to make the practice site you're considering viable and desirable. There are other people who do it. However, the truth is, I think I defined most of the rules people are using on that. So let me explain how I came up with them and what you ought to know about it, in order to say, yes, this is a viable site or it's a good place to go or not. Not so much on that one specific site, but rather the fundamental principles that you need to follow. Now, when I started doing demographic reports for doctors, and I hate to say it, this was close to 40 years ago, I was asked if I could break out the data into circle radii in miles. So somebody had said you need to do 1, 5, and 10 mile radius around a practice, and you should judge by that. Well, the science of demographics has improved a lot since that time, and vendors are much more realistic about the metrics that they're using to make the case, is the place viable, desirable, or not, and how should we promote the practices if we go in there? Now, this is not true of just any healthcare practice, but generally what I've done is I've taken the data that's available and interpreted it based upon the different practice types and their priorities. Now, let me back up and say these radii are usually expressed in concentric circles, where the practice site is in the middle of the inner ring. At least that's what everybody has always thought of. Now that makes sense, I think, but rather than circles, for the purposes of healthcare practices, we need to consider a different way of defining the boundaries. It's done by drive time. After all, you see, patients will only travel just so far to a general practice. And I've calculated just how far that will be in rural, suburban, and urban areas. In urban areas, for example, people are less willing to drive any kind of a distance or to travel on public transportation as far as they will in a rural area or in a suburb. Now, I've calculated just how far that is for rural, suburban, and urban areas, as well as the optimum distance for each type of practice. And I say that optometrists have a different distance that people are willing to drive. The same thing is true of dentists. Same thing is true of physicians. Now, for specialty practice, the distance may be further. In other words, people will travel further to get to a specialty practice. Now, once again, there are several variables that influence the typical and optimum distances that people will travel. So if I'm doing a demographic report, I need to match the data with the radius around the practice site to make sure it's realistic. And that's not an easy thing to do. I just have years of doing it. Now, we know that people do not limit themselves to circle areas. So they don't look at a 1 mile, 5 mile, and 10 mile radius. They're looking at other factors that regard how to get to a place, and I'll talk about those in just a minute. You see, roads are not set up in circle areas. We have to do, consideration of other factors to look at practice boundaries and their targets. The density of the population, the amount of growth, the amount of competition in that area all matter. So you need to know certain facts that most people will kind of forget, and it will be very helpful to determine the likelihood of success and making a lot of money in the practice. Now, I mentioned you need to consider not circles around the practice or the office that are concentric. Ideally, you're looking at a drive time map. Now, I've got on the screen right now an example of what I'm talking about. So a 5-minute radius is a fairly small geographic area, and the 10-minute and 15-minute radii, they're very important to know. But remember, it's in terms of the time it takes to get to the location you're looking at. Ultimately, you're going to, probably notice that this doesn't look like a circle. It looks like an amoeba. And that is ultimately the fact you want to kind of keep in mind where people come from. There are lots of reasons why this looks this way. The speed limit is one, because if a road is easily traveled at a certain speed, the radius expressed in time is going to be better. By the way, we call those isochrones, time distance measurements. Now, we would never want to waste time and money on sending messages. And instead of the term message, let's talk about flyers or advertisements to people who can't or won't use your services. Sometimes potential patients are just too far away. And sometimes their demographics are making it unlikely that they're going to want and need you. Well, take, for example, people who are really, really poor or lack education. You see, these are factors that you have to fight against to build a practice up. As an example, some activists, and I'm being just a little tongue-in-cheek here, believe that men can become pregnant and bring a baby to term. And if you are an OBGYN, there may be people who say, yes, you've got to help me as a man get pregnant. But we know that there are very few men who get pregnant, if any. And so it is likely that there is not a sufficient demand for a male-only OBGYN to make it worth specializing in that field. Now, I suppose there's some places that male patients who want to become pregnant will demand those services, but I'm not going to bet on it. You see, instead, you want to focus on women in childbearing years, and that makes a lot more sense as a practice focus and as a target for the OBGYN type practice. As you can see on the previous slide, the various drive time radii resemble amoebas, and they're not smooth boundaries. And that's because of topography and other factors like speed limits that cause uneven boundaries on the outskirts. These factors will be vital in determining the viability of the practice site. Data that is included shows the population in each drive time radius, as I showed you. The analysts at Dr. Demographics can present these factors and interpret them for you based on your needs given your type of practice. If a more convenient location is available, now we can make recommendations on their viability. But here's something you have to understand. A person will go to an orthodontist, but generally they don't want to travel very far, because in the course of treatment, you're doing several visits to the orthodontist. Now, you're not going to do that with a general dentist, or especially not with an oral surgeon. So knowing something about the treatment plans will matter as to how far someone should put their practice relative to that population center. That's kind of important for you to know in terms of practice site viability. Now, there's another kind of map we often use, and that's called an orientation map. What it shows are the major roads and the minor roads and the population centers and the competition. I can actually tell you where the competition is relative to your practice site. And I believe here I put a flag on where a practice was that we were looking at. Now, it doesn't have a large number of competitors, but it's rather nice to know if they're putting in a new road or they're building a new development, where that's going to be relative to your office. And that is why I ask you what you want to know. But generally, we're going to give you orientation maps that show competition. Not every competitor is going to be listed, but the vast majority will. Now, it's also possible for us to create a map that shows landmarks, including competition. You see, after all, the site you were contemplating does not exist in isolation. You might be near a shopping mall, which makes it a more desirable thing. It may be a large place, a factory, or a large employer. You see, these things matter, and we have to put them on a map to designate how significant they are as a factor toward the site being viable. Now, sometimes the practices will have to be regional, sometimes local, and the transportation arteries need to reflect that. These maps are very useful for that purpose. Look, more traffic flowing by a practice site is a good thing. It's not perfect, because sometimes the traffic may be so significant that nobody wants to go to it. We want to know how visible the building is and its signage, and that is significant as well. The area's demographics can be subpar, but if many people can easily find it and get to it, it may be a strong mitigating factor in favor of the location, maybe in favor of the price that you're paying. If there's a freeway off-ramp that leads easily to the office parking lot, so much the better. Now, while it may not be a demographic factor, there are other aspects of the practice site that could be making a practice startup or purchase a good idea. But demographics alone usually isn't sufficient to say, oh yeah, it's a good place to go. We can make the determination not only about how many people there are, but also their lifestyles or propensity to use those kinds of services that you're offering. Now, what if the purchase price was a deal? I mean, you are making a really wise purchase, and the patient base was somehow attached to another office or facility that can make a big difference as well. All have to be weighed for their relative worth or value. It's not an easy determination that we have to make, but it is a metric that is based on fact. Now, this is a zip code map, and you'll notice that the zip codes are almost all oriented on north-south axes. We always show what the major transportation arteries are as well. With this in hand, you can easily say to a lender, hey, this is going to be a place that a lot of people are going to be driving by and desire, and you need to give me the money. Now, it's possible for us to provide the orientation map that shows landmarks, competition, and zip codes. And again, what you're trying to do is demonstrate to your lender and to other investors that it's a good idea to do this. Keep in mind that zip code boundaries are based on U.S. postal priorities, not on the characteristics of the road. They start with a small area called a carrier route, which is identified often as having 9 numbers. It can go higher. When I'm saying that, carrier routes are like zip codes. They have an identifying number. Zip codes that most of us use are going to be 5-digit. If they have a zip +4, that may go to, 9. These are joined together as carrier routes to form a zip code. Now, keep this in mind. A carrier route literally means that's the area that is compact enough that a single postal worker can walk the route to deliver mail. Zip codes are almost always too large, but not necessarily, because the number of people who live in a zip code is very confusing. Sometimes they have a lot of people in a square mile, sometimes very few. Now, what happens is the post office will adjust the boundaries to zip codes and carrier routes very quickly, especially if the zip code boundaries are showing more people living in them than before. If the population changes quickly, the post office will adjust the boundaries just as quickly. The reason that this is important for your office is to create a mailing list that makes sense to market your practice. The contiguous zip codes or postal codes are coded so that a 3, 5, and 9-digit code is what is being represented. So if they tell that to you, the zip +4 will be obvious, but not always. That's why I'm saying we have the databases at Dr. Demographics to help you figure out exactly who and how many people are going to live in that zip code. It can be understood as and this is their term, rational postal zone. Although they are subject to change, don't forget that, because very often an area that's growing quickly will change in a year. Demographic data is often assigned by assigning demographics to that particular zip code by third-party data vendors. We subscribe to those. So I can tell you in any given part of the United States how many people live within those zip codes and what type of people they are, what their demographic characteristics are. Now, ESRI is a vendor of lifestyle. I mean, they go through various facts, and they will say within the zip code, and we'll take 94103 as an example, the largest group are called trendsetters. I will give you a little idea. Every time we do a report, we'll explain who the people are who live in that area and what kind of psychographics they have. But we'll also look at the competition rate. How many competitors in your field are there within that zip code? In this one, Social Security said, which are usually people who are older, usually over 75 or 80 years old. And that makes them good for some kinds of practices, but not for others. If you look at laptops and lattes, that 19% figure, that's a fair number of people, but usually they're very well educated and moderately affluent. So knowing those things about the people who live in each of the zip codes, and we'll provide you that breakout, You can make your decisions on what kinds of services you're likely to offer them. Now, remember, with psychographics and demographics, you're looking at age, income, educational attainment. That's what you're wanting to know. Now, I use the example of suburban splendor. That's one of the psychographic groups that ESRI puts out. And let me just read the first paragraph, starting with the demographic. The median age in suburban splendor neighborhoods is 40 years old, slightly older than the U.S. median age of 36. I bet you didn't know that. Now, these married couples are families that live in single-family homes with children. They have very good credit, and most of them are white, with an above-average Asian population also represented. Household growth in this segment is almost 2 times that of the national average. I'm living in Utah and broadcasting from Utah, and suburban splendor is a dominant group. Laptops and lattes are also, if you go to Silicon Slopes, a nearby high-tech neighborhood where Texas Instruments is building a new chip manufacturing plant. If you want those kind of patients, this is a segment you want to go for, and not pay so much attention to those who don't have good education or make much money. Now, as I mentioned, there's a lot of information I provide on each of these households. Suburban Splendor have 111, let's just say 111,500 houses in that category. Now, knowing how many there are and what percentage they are allows you to market wisely. And that's why I include this in the marketing report. Families in the suburban splendor segment rank first among the home ownership. Now, I love home ownership. I think it's terrific to target, but it's not always possible in every part of the United States. I mention all this because there's, usually 2 pages worth of data that I include on each of the lifestyle groups. I'll even go so far as to say, given the kind of practice you have, there may be special implications. So dermatologists, endocrinologists, dentists all have different priorities, and this report can tell you what those priorities are. Now, as for how you promote the practice, I can even put some ideas in there as well. Many doctors are interested in where in the geographic region the most affluent or poor, old and young, well-educated or poorly educated can be found relative to the office site. Now, I bring that up because the way that you promote your practice and sell your services matters on the geographic area that it is found in, and you need to know how the population is divided. Now, for example, I recently had a doctor who said, look, I want people who make $50,000 to $75,000 a year and have a child living in the home who's between 12 and 15 years of age. Now, that's great for some practices, not good for others. Dental implants are not really sold well for these populations given their ages. There are, however, a myriad of the services that are perfect for the population with that age. Now, here's the thing. Direct mail is one of the more impactful media that you can use. A lot of people are saying, oh, no, it's getting a list of emails. Well, I'm going to say they can both do very well if you have the right email addresses and the population to back it up. But this is in itself a kind of database report. So for $125, I can tell you roughly how many people are in each zip code or in each drive time radius around a site. that does require a lot of work for us. But from this, we can then take the data and say, this is who you should send to. It may be a computer file. It may be peel and stick envelopes. We have several options. But the idea is you want to cost effectively be able to take the message about your practice to the people who live and work in that area. And that's what this is all about. The finished list will come usually on a computer file that you can give to a mailing house or print in your office on self-adhesive stickers, like the Avery labels that you see at Office Depot. Now, I don't recommend you use that as your primary means of publicity. Usually, it will mean that you have to do a first-class mailing. If you use a mail house, people who process mail, they can print right on the mailer, and we can organize that mailer so it will look good. But the costs are dramatically less. And I'm saying often less than a fifth of the cost of first-class mail. Yes, you can do first-class mailing, but I don't suggest you do more than 50 of them at a time. It's a lot of work, and I don't think it's as impactful as a mail house can make it. If you need recommendations on who can process your mailing, Dr. Demographics has a little list of people who can help you. And we can help generate the mailing list for you. Now, some people have given up on bulk mail rates, but we have found there's an impact that a physical mailer will have that email and electric mail, like Constant Contact delivers, just cannot match. So it's worth your investment. I have said in another episode, Dr. Demographics looks at a large number of factors about a practice site and purchase area to advise our clients whether a site is desirable or viable, as well as what inducements you might want to be using. How do you get these people to do things? How do you move the needle as far as your marketing is concerned? Now, I spoke last week about the benefits of using agenda setting and framing theory. That helps make your marketing overall more effective. Unfortunately, there are not many people advising doctors who understand those theories, and we can help you. So we're going to tell you who to mail to, how much it's going to cost you, who can be the vendors. We'll also talk about the inducements that you should use. And this will go not only for a mailer, but for your website and other things. We do this in what we call a marketing report. And ultimately, we're going to pinpoint exactly where you are thinking about going and how desirable it is and how to do it. The reason we offer a viability study with a lifestyle, and this is the psychographic component, is that we understand that not all people are the same. They're favored. They favor some reasons to go and see your people in your profession. And sometimes it's cost, and sometimes it's not. There are lots of reasons why this has to happen. But ultimately, the idea of using a marketing report is to make all of your marketing more cost efficient. You're going to get more bang for the buck. In healthcare, one size fits all is a myth, and it mustn't. Well, I wouldn't do it. You've got to think about what the consumers are thinking about, and this is the only scientific way to go about doing it. The point is that not everybody wants and needs the same thing from healthcare from the people who are your competitors. Market research will help you understand what they do want and what they perceive they want. The assumption is that knowledge will attract the people to the practice who live and work in your area by offering the right mix of services for them. But this research is not often done by our competitors. In fact, I had one very large competitor who believed that demographics and psychographics were unimportant. He sort of believed doesn't matter. Everybody wants the same thing. They want cheap healthcare. Well, there are lots of ways to interpret cheap, low cost, discount, whatever. And typically, they would charge a lot and deliver very little. Now, let me go back to the big questions for demographics. Whom do you want to serve? Who do you want to serve? Who lives in the area? And how do you move the needle on the action quickly? See, it's one thing to put out a message and hope within a year it will deliver for you. That isn't good enough. You've got to get people to respond right away, and you need to know the key terms and inducements to make that happen. Now, there are two reports I want to have you consider. The first is called the Quick View Report. It's a localized demographic report that probably is our lowest priced report, and samples are on our website at drdemographics.com. But then there is the marketing report, which is much more detailed and content-oriented. I strongly recommend it. If you'd like to talk to us, give us a call at 800-849-0499 or go to our website at drdemographics.com. Prices are on the drop-down menu. Almost all these reports have samples that you can order, and we want you to be successful. That's why this little extra effort is worth to us. And thanks so much for watching.